Most people think empathy is a gentle trait, soft, emotional, harmless. They imagine the empath as someone who absorbs the world like a sponge, overwhelmed by every feeling, every shift in tone, every tremor in the atmosphere. And for many empaths, this is true. Their sensitivity becomes a wound they carry everywhere, a doorway through which other people's emotions rush in without warning. But there is a different kind of empath, a rarer kind, forged not in innocence, but in fire. One who emerges not from comfort, but from psychological confrontation with the darker layers of human nature. This is where the dark empath begins. In the early years of their life, the dark empath looks just like the ordinary empath. They feel everything too deeply, trust too quickly, and get pulled into the emotional storms of others without understanding why. They become the confidant, the emotional caretaker, the one who absorbs tension so others don't have to face themselves. Jung described this early stage as the unconscious feeling function, a sensitivity without direction, without boundaries, without understanding. But life does not allow such innocence to remain untouched. The dark empath encounters manipulation, betrayal, psychological violence, and the raw shadow of other people long before they are prepared for it. And instead of breaking, something else happens. They awaken. There is a moment, subtle but irreversible, when the empath realizes that feeling deeply is not the same as being vulnerable. Pain stops being chaos and becomes information. They begin to see patterns in human behavior, motives behind actions, and the unconscious scripts that make people act in ways they don't understand themselves. Jung would say that this is the moment when the shadow enters consciousness, when the psyche stops operating through instinct and begins to operate through awareness. The empath who integrates this awareness does not become colder, they become clearer. They do not stop feeling, they start interpreting. This transformation is what gives birth to the dark empath, someone who still senses emotional currents with extraordinary depth, but no longer drowns in them. They don't absorb everything indiscriminately. They filter, evaluate, and decode. Their sensitivity becomes a form of intelligence, a psychological instrument that reads meaning in places where others only feel discomfort. They begin to notice what no one else sees, the false confidence in someone's voice, the contradiction between what a person says and what they actually want, the tension that rises when a hidden truth is nearby. They see the gap between the persona someone performs and the shadow they try to hide behind it.
People misunderstand this clarity. They think the dark empath is cold, distant, or detached, but what they are sensing is something different. Someone who no longer reacts emotionally before understanding the situation. Someone who feels but does not collapse. Someone who knows that beneath every smile there is a structure of motivations, fears, defenses, and wounds. The dark empath becomes, without choosing to, a psychological observer. Their attention goes deeper than the words spoken. They hear the intention behind the tone. They feel the discomfort behind the silence. They understand the shadow behind the behavior. This is why the dark empath is rare. Not because empathy is rare, but because integrated empathy is. Jung insisted that true psychological power comes only to those who confront the darkness within themselves, and the dark empath has survived that descent. They have recognized their own wounds, their own shadows, their own patterns, and because they understand their own unconscious, they can see through the unconscious of others with eerie accuracy. They are not fooled by charm, status, performance, or emotional theatrics. Their perception penetrates the facade effortlessly. And this is the moment when their presence begins to unsettle people. Something in the dark empath's gaze feels too aware, too calm, too penetrating. It is not judgment, it is clarity. a clarity that reveals truths others spend their entire lives trying to avoid. People sense that they cannot lie convincingly to this person, that manipulation will not work in subtle ways, that emotional games lose power in their presence. They sense that this person notices things they themselves haven't noticed yet. And they're right. Because all dark empaths share one foundational trait, one that appears early, quietly, and almost invisibly. It is the trait that changes everything, the trait that marks the moment they stop being overwhelmed by the world and start reading it with surgical insight. The trait that makes them perceptive in ways that defy explanation, intuitive in ways that feel almost psychic, and aware in ways that make people whisper, "I feel like you see right through me." And yet, this trait is only the beginning. It is the doorway to everything that comes after. It is what gives the dark empath their first real power, the ability to perceive what no one else notices. And it is here, in this silent shift from feeling to understanding, that the first dangerous trait begins to take shape, a trait that allows the dark empath to perceive what others are desperately trying to hide.
Every dark empath carries a kind of inner instrument, an emotional radar so precise that even they struggle to explain how it works. They don't gather information by questioning or observing in a conventional sense. They gather it through atmosphere, energy, the subtle shifts in human behavior that most people never register. Jung described the superior feeling function as an organ of valuation, something capable of reading emotional truth before the mind has time to interpret it. For the dark empath, this organ operates continuously, silently, and involuntarily. When they walk into a room, the first thing they sense is not the decor or the noise, it's the emotional temperature. They know immediately who is tense, who is hiding something, who is masking insecurity with humor, who is performing confidence, and who is carrying fresh resentment under their smile. They sense these things the way others sense a draft of cold air, automatically and without needing to think about it. They notice micro-expressions so fleeting they barely exist, the tightening of a jaw that betrays anger, the drop in someone's tone that reveals doubt, the half-second pause before a lie. Their perception is not mystical, it is acute sensitivity, refined by psychological awareness. And more importantly, they perceive intention. Before someone speaks, the dark empath already knows whether the conversation will be honest or manipulative, whether the person is seeking connection or control, whether they are masking jealousy or fishing for validation. These intentions radiate through a person's emotional field long before any words are spoken, and the dark empath catches them instantly. It is not deduction, it is recognition. The psyche of the dark empath meets the psyche of the other person long before the conversation begins. Most people listen to words first and feelings second. The dark empath reverses this order. They hear the energy of the interaction before the content. They sense the emotional plot line before the story starts. And because they understand these patterns so well, they rarely get surprised by people. Jung would say the unconscious speaks through mood and gesture long before it speaks through language. And this is what the dark empath is attuned to, the pre-verbal truth, the raw emotional current that reveals what someone will never admit openly.
This is why they are so unnerving to certain personalities. Manipulators feel their strategies weaken. Narcissists feel their performances losing effect. People who rely on confusion and emotional chaos sense a kind of unwanted clarity in the dark empath's presence. They don't understand why, but they become careful, controlled, self-edited. Something inside them whispers, "This person sees too much." And they are right, because the dark empath is scanning for inconsistencies, contradictions, and emotional leakage without even trying to.
But the dark empath is not judging what they perceive. They are evaluating it. They are categorizing emotional signals the way a musician categorizes notes. They see patterns: who needs reassurance, who wants domination, who carries old childhood wounds into adult conflicts, who is acting from fear, and who is acting from ego inflation. All of this happens quickly, quietly, beneath the surface of the interaction. It is the psychological equivalent of instinct combined with analysis, sensitivity combined with shadow awareness. Yet the most dangerous part of this trait is not its accuracy, it is its silence. The dark empath doesn't announce what they know. They don't expose the lies or confront the manipulation. They don't need to. They simply adjust. They take a mental step back and watch the other person reveal themselves more clearly, more desperately, more unconsciously. People don't realize that the dark empath has already mapped the emotional environment long before the first argument, the first betrayal, or the first attempt at manipulation. And that map gives them an advantage most people never see coming. This is why a dark empath rarely stays in situations where they are being used, lied to, or exploited. They sense the shift before it becomes visible. They notice the micro changes in someone's behavior, the colder tone, the delayed reply, the forced enthusiasm, the subtle distancing. They catch the pre-betrayal energy that others only recognize in hindsight. Their radar picks up the emotional tremor of disloyalty or manipulation weeks, sometimes months before it fully appears. To the outside world, it looks like intuition. To the dark empath, it feels like certainty. But here is the part few people understand. Perceiving others is not what makes the dark empath dangerous. Many sensitive people can feel deeply. What makes the dark empath dangerous is what they choose to do or not do with this perception. They don't react emotionally. They don't confront impulsively. They don't expose the truth prematurely. Instead, they remain still, conscious, observant. They let the truth reveal itself at its own pace. And this calm, analytical patience is the first psychological weapon of the dark empath. Because perception alone does not intimidate people, but perception combined with silence does. And it is precisely this silence that leads to the second trait, one far more unsettling and far more powerful.
The second trait of the dark empath is not something they do consciously. It is something that happens around them, almost like an atmospheric reaction. People begin to reveal themselves in their presence, not because the dark empath asks, questions, or challenges, but because their very energy acts as a psychological mirror. Jung taught that the shadow is everything we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves, everything we exile to the unconscious because we cannot tolerate seeing it directly. Most people walk through life wearing a persona carefully built to protect them from this truth. But when they interact with the dark empath, that protection weakens. The dark empath does not need to speak for this effect to occur. Their calm awareness, their grounded presence, their lack of emotional reactivity creates a reflective field where people sense themselves more clearly than they ever intended. This is not a spiritual phenomenon. It is psychological transparency. People feel seen, and that feeling is profoundly uncomfortable when they have spent years avoiding their own inner reality. The dark empath does not expose the shadow with accusations or analysis. The exposure happens silently, through contrast. Their honesty illuminates another's self-deception. Their awareness highlights another's blind spots. Their inner clarity makes the other person's contradictions suddenly visible. Most individuals are not prepared for this. When someone projects confidence but secretly fears inadequacy, the dark empath feels the insecurity beneath the surface instantly. When someone performs kindness but carries resentment in their tone, the dark empath senses the hostility. When someone pretends to be in control but vibrates with fear, the dark empath detects the tremor under the facade. And because they do not react emotionally, the pretender feels their performance slipping. The persona can only survive when the audience cooperates. A dark empath does not cooperate.
This is why certain personalities, narcissists, manipulators, people addicted to control, feel threatened without understanding why. They sense that their usual psychological tactics don't land. Their charm feels weaker. Their lies feel clumsy. Their manipulations fall flat. They attempt to perform who they want to be seen as, but the dark empath's presence reflects who they actually are. Jung would say that the shadow becomes restless when confronted with consciousness, and that restlessness turns into discomfort, defensiveness, or even hostility.
The ordinary empath absorbs this hostility, feeling responsible for the emotional chaos erupting around them. The dark empath does not. They understand that projections are not personal. They see the mechanism clearly. The other person is not reacting to them. They are reacting to themselves. And this is precisely why the dark empath becomes a mirror rather than a sponge. They don't internalize the attack. They don't collapse into guilt or confusion. They analyze. They observe. They let the other person reveal the architecture of their psyche. This reflective capacity becomes especially powerful in intimate relationships, workplaces, and friendships where people rely heavily on their persona. When someone is lying to themselves about their intentions, the dark empath doesn't need to confront them. The truth eventually leaks through facial tension, vocal tone, inconsistent behavior, or misplaced emotion. The dark empath catches all of it, and whether they speak about it or not, the other person senses that something hidden has been seen. This unconscious recognition triggers one of two reactions. Either the person becomes vulnerable and honest, or they become defensive and aggressive. And here lies the danger. Nobody likes seeing their shadow. Most prefer to destroy the mirror rather than confront the reflection. When a dark empath triggers this involuntary self-recognition, the other person may blame them, accuse them, distance themselves, or attack them with increasing intensity. The dark empath has learned, often from bitter experience, that being a mirror means being blamed for what the mirror shows. But instead of breaking, they grow stronger. They stop taking projections personally and begin to understand them as data, as pure psychological information that reveals the truth beneath the persona. This is where their power shifts from reactive to strategic. The dark empath no longer gets pulled into emotional chaos. They no longer accept roles in psychological dramas they didn't sign up for. They understand the shadow so well that they refuse to participate in its games. And this refusal, this calm refusal, leads to the next trait, one that few people ever see coming. Because once the dark empath understands the shadow in others, they stop responding emotionally. They stop engaging in the familiar dance of tension and reaction. They observe without participating. And this emotional non-participation does something extraordinary. It destabilizes anyone who relies on emotional manipulation, confusion, or control. And so the third trait begins to take form, the most misunderstood, the most disarming, and the most psychologically powerful of them all.
There is a specific moment in the evolution of every dark empath when something fundamental shifts. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is not even visible to most people. It is the moment they stop reacting emotionally to behavior that once would have consumed them. This is not numbness or withdrawal. It is clarity. Jung taught that when the unconscious becomes conscious, a person stops being controlled by the emotional storms of others. And this is exactly what happens in the dark empath. The emotional hooks of other people simply stop working. Most individuals navigate relationships through emotional cause and effect. Someone becomes angry and they feel compelled to defend themselves. Someone becomes distant and they chase. Someone withholds affection and they plead. Someone uses guilt and they fold. The ordinary empath is especially vulnerable to this because their identity is tied to the emotional states of others. They feel responsible for maintaining harmony, even at the cost of their own well-being. The dark empath evolves beyond this. They begin to see emotional manipulation as a pattern rather than a personal attack. When someone becomes angry to gain control, the dark empath notices the pattern. When someone becomes cold to punish them, they see the mechanism. When someone tries to guilt trip them into compliance, they recognize the script. And because they see these dynamics with such clarity, they stop participating. They stop feeding the drama. They stop providing the emotional fuel that manipulative personalities rely on. This non-participation is not passive. It is strategic. It is the quiet decision to stay centered in one's own emotional reality rather than getting swept into someone else's unconscious chaos. The dark empath remains calm while the other person escalates. They remain observant while the other becomes reactive. They remain psychologically present while the other becomes consumed by the very games that once controlled the empath. And this calmness infuriates those who depend on emotional volatility to maintain power. Manipulators feel it first. Their usual tactics fall flat. The raised voice, the guilt, the passive aggressiveness, the sudden sadness that appears conveniently at key moments, none of it lands. The dark empath doesn't argue or explain or justify. They simply observe. They remain emotionally still. And to someone who thrives on psychological chaos, that stillness is unbearable. It exposes the manipulation without the dark empath needing to say a word.
Narcissists feel it too. Their need for emotional reaction, admiration, fear, anger, validation, goes unmet. The dark empath does not feed the inflated persona, nor do they collapse under the narcissist's criticism. They simply refuse to enter the emotional arena. And without that participation, the narcissist experiences a kind of emotional starvation. Their control slips, their facade cracks, their game collapses under its own weight. Dominating personalities also struggle with this trait. They rely on tension, conflict, and intensity to control social spaces. They expect people to submit or resist. Both reactions allow them to maintain the role they've chosen. But the dark empath does neither. They do not submit, and they do not fight. They remain unaffected, and this quiet neutrality destabilizes the entire power dynamic. The controlling person senses something they cannot articulate. I cannot move this person. And that realization is psychologically threatening. The brilliance of the dark empath's emotional non-participation is that it shifts the entire structure of the interaction. Instead of being a piece on someone else's emotional chessboard, they become the observer of the game. And when you observe the game, you no longer lose pieces. You no longer get trapped. You no longer get cornered by someone else's unconscious strategies. The dark empath's refusal to react forces the other person's psyche to reveal itself more fully. The patterns emerge. The shadow exposes itself. And the dark empath, calm and centered, learns exactly what they are dealing with. But the real danger of this trait is not how it disarms others. It is how it empowers the dark empath to navigate human behavior with precision. When you stop reacting emotionally, you start seeing clearly. You start making decisions with foresight instead of fear. You begin moving strategically instead of impulsively. The dark empath's inner world becomes steady, unshakable, resistant to psychological intrusion. And this stability marks the transition into the fourth trait, a trait that transforms empathy from sensitivity into strategy. Because once a dark empath stops participating in emotional manipulation, they begin to use empathy in a new way, not to absorb, not to rescue, but to navigate with precision. And this strategic use of emotion is what turns the dark empath into someone truly formidable, someone who can outmaneuver the unconscious patterns of others without ever raising their voice. And yet, there is an even deeper transformation ahead, one that completes the psychological architecture of the Dark Empath. It is the fourth and fifth trait, and together, they form the core of why a Dark Empath cannot be controlled.
As the Dark Empath evolves, something extraordinary happens. The emotional radar that once overwhelmed them has been refined. The shadow mirror that once frightened others has become natural. The emotional non-participation that once felt like self-protection has become a way of moving through the world with clarity. And now, these abilities merge into something far more powerful, a form of empathy that is not reactive, but strategic. Jung would say the psyche has reached a stage where feeling and shadow no longer operate separately, but have fused into a single, conscious instrument. This is where the fourth trait emerges, the strategic heart. The strategic heart is not coldness, it is not manipulation. It is the ability to understand human emotion from a higher vantage point without drowning in it. The Dark Empath sees emotional patterns the way a navigator sees a map. They recognize how one action will trigger a specific reaction, how one insecurity will lead to a predictable defense, how a wounded ego will respond with a familiar pattern of withdrawal or aggression. They understand how people move emotionally long before those people understand themselves. And because of this understanding, the Dark Empath can choose responses that de-escalate conflict, avoid manipulation, prevent triangulation, and reveal truth without confrontation. Their empathy becomes precise. They speak in ways that calm the insecure. They remain silent in ways that expose the manipulator. They step back in ways that reveal true motives. They offer warmth in ways that disarm tension. None of this is calculated cruelty. It is conscious navigation. They are no longer reacting to the emotional chaos of others. They are guiding themselves through it with intention. Jung wrote that true feeling intelligence is not sentimental. It is discerning. It knows what to give, when to give, and to whom to give it. The Dark Empath's heart becomes strategic because it is no longer controlled by fear, guilt, or unconscious wounds. But strategic empathy alone is not what makes them unshakable. Beneath it lies the fifth and final trait, the unshakable center. This is the psychological core that emerges only after someone has confronted their own shadow, integrated their unconscious, and refused to be emotionally controlled by others. It is individuation, not in theory, but in lived reality. The Dark Empath no longer seeks validation from those around them. They no longer crumble when someone disapproves. They no longer chase affection, acceptance, or recognition. Their sense of self is internal, grounded, and immune to the turbulence of other people's moods. This inner stability changes everything. When you are no longer moved by emotional manipulation, you become unpredictable to those who depend on control. When you are no longer driven by insecurity, you become immune to psychological games. When you no longer fear losing people, you stop tolerating those who drain you. And when your center no longer collapses under pressure, you become someone who cannot be dominated, deceived, or destabilized. This is the true power of the Dark Empath. They do not need to defeat anyone. They simply cannot be defeated psychologically. People feel this stability. They sense that the Dark Empath is not shaken by conflict, not afraid of truth, not dependent on approval. They feel a kind of quiet authority, not aggressive, not loud, but unmistakably solid. Conversations change in their presence. The emotional temperature adjusts. Games lose power. Masks slip. People either rise to honesty or fall into exposure. The Dark Empath becomes the calm center of every interaction, and others unconsciously orbit around that steadiness. This unshakable center is the final stage of Jungian development in the Dark Empath. It is where empathy, shadow work, individuation, and emotional intelligence converge. It is where the person stops being shaped by the unconscious forces of others and begins shaping their own psychological landscape with intention. And because they operate from this center, they no longer live in reaction, they live in awareness. Their heart becomes wise, their mind becomes quiet, and their perception becomes razor sharp. And this is what ultimately allows the dark empath to outsmart everyone. Not through deception, not through strategy alone, but through the simple, undeniable truth that they cannot be controlled by the unconscious, neither their own nor anyone else's. Jung said that the person who has made the unconscious conscious is no longer a victim of fate. The dark empath is the embodiment of that truth. They have walked through the fire of sensitivity, shadow, betrayal, and awakening, and emerged whole. In the end, the dark empath is not dangerous because they harm others. They are dangerous because they see clearly. They feel deeply without drowning. They recognize patterns without reacting. They understand the shadow without fearing it. And they stand at the center of their own psyche with a steadiness that cannot be corrupted. This is the completion of their psychological architecture. The empath who has become entire, who has integrated every part of themselves, who has gained the one thing no manipulator can control, a self that is fully conscious.